On a May day in 2026, Air Force One, on a national mission, landed in the flag-strewn, flower-decorated city of Beijing. Donald Trump and his entourage of CEOs, with a combined net worth of $10 trillion, including Elon Musk, Tim Cook, and others were there. This video will highlight the multi-trillion-dollar financial cards hidden behind the elegant suits of these billionaires. Watch until the end or you'll miss the moment that exposes inequality. Trump punishing Canada for doing exactly what he's begging Xi Jinping to do. Trump's desperation. Presidency running out of time. Air Force One touched down in Beijing on the evening of the 13th of May 2026. Not as a display of strength. As a confession. The aircraft, a specially modified Boeing 747-200B designated VC-25A, had cost the American government approximately $325 million to acquire. Every hour that aircraft remained in flight cost approximately $200,000 in operational expenses, fuel for the massive jet, crew salaries for personnel trained in presidential protocol, maintenance protocols for engines that must perform flawlessly across 5,000 miles of open ocean, encrypted communication systems hardwired into nuclear command structures, medical facilities capable of performing emergency surgery at 43,000 feet altitude. The arithmetic compounds into roughly $5,100 per minute of continuous flight time. The round-trip journey from Washington to Beijing requires approximately 28 to 30 hours of flight time. That calculates to $5.6 to $6 million spent on a single aircraft crossing, not including the support aircraft, ground crews, security personnel, or the C-17 Globemaster cargo planes that transported the presidential motorcade across the Pacific. Those aircraft cost approximately $400 million each to procure. The operational cost of deploying that single cargo transport fuel for heavy aircraft, crew salaries, logistics coordination exceeded several million dollars for this single mission. Donald Trump descended those stairs not as the dominant superpower bringing a reluctant nation to negotiate. He descended as a president who needed a win. His approval ratings had fallen to record lows. The war against Iran, launched on February 28th with predictions of 4 to 6 weeks duration, had now entered its third month with no end visible. The Strait of Hormuz remained under blockade. Global energy prices had spiked. Gas prices at American pumps had climbed sharply. American voters were angry. The midterm elections were in November. Trump needed deliverables before the American electorate rendered their judgment on his administration's competence. The agenda packed into 48 hours was impossibly expansive. Trade negotiations spanning decades of disputes. Taiwan, the territory China claims and America helps defend. Artificial intelligence dominance. The Iran conflict itself. Rare earth element exports critical to American manufacturing. Semiconductor manufacturing restrictions. Boeing aircraft orders worth potentially billions of dollars. Soybeans and beef negotiations for American agricultural exports. The case of Jimmy Lai, the jailed Hong Kong publisher. Almost every contentious issue between two superpowers compressed into 2 days. The kind of agenda that signals not strength, but urgency and desperation. Even the experts the administration was briefing had lowered expectations to the absolute floor before negotiations even began. The Council on Foreign Relations described the summit as an effort to stabilize the relationship rather than resolve any long-standing disputes. The Brookings Institution put it bluntly, both sides want stability. Nobody is expecting deliverables. The Stimson Center added that Trump would at least try to enlist Xi to pressure Iran back to negotiations. The word was try. The President of the United States was flying 12 hours just to try. That revelation encapsulated everything about the geopolitical moment. The beast, presidential mobility as fortress. When Trump descended the stairs of Air Force One, he stepped directly into a vehicle that cost approximately $1.5 million and weighed nearly 20,000 pounds. The Secret Service calls it Cadillac One. Calling it a limousine is technically accurate but vastly insufficient. The chassis is based on a Chevrolet Kodiak heavy truck, but the superstructure is military-grade armor plate, 8-inch thick doors, windows reinforced with 5 inches of layered glass capable of withstanding .50 caliber rifle fire at point-blank range. The tires contain solid rubber cores that allow the vehicle to continue moving at highway speeds even after complete puncture. This single vehicle sits at the center of a motorcade that includes 20 to 50 additional vehicles. Escort vehicles driven by Secret Service personnel trained in advanced evasive driving. Counter-assault teams positioned strategically throughout the column. Electronic warfare units capable of jamming hostile signals. Medical response units carrying blood types matched to the president. Communication vehicles maintain continuous connection to the Pentagon. Hazmat vehicles sampling air for radiological, biological, and chemical threats. The total motorcade represents an investment in mobile security infrastructure exceeding $100 million across all vehicles, equipment, and specialized modifications. For financial context, a Rolls-Royce Phantom, the pinnacle of civilian luxury automotive engineering, costs approximately $500,000 to $700,000. The Beast costs more than double that. A Bentley Mulsanne, the ultimate expression of English automotive luxury, retails around $350,000. The Beast is worth more than 4 Bentleys combined. A Lamborghini Veneno, one of the most exclusive hypercars ever manufactured, costs approximately $4.5 million. The entire Beast motorcade infrastructure represents roughly 2 to 3% of that value. The motorcade moved through Beijing streets at precisely 45 miles per hour, not approximately, exactly. The distance between vehicles never varied more than 2 feet. The suspension system, engineered for a vehicle 1/4 this heavy, had been completely rebuilt with components from military combat vehicles. The engine, a 6.6-liter Duramax V8 turbo diesel, produced massive torque. The soundproofing was so complete that the president could whisper inside the vehicle and be heard clearly, while outside sirens wailing at 120 decibels sounded like distant background noise. As the motorcade reached intersections, NSA mathematicians had designed the positioning pattern using encryption algorithms. Even if someone knew which vehicle the president occupied at the start, they could not predict his location 30 seconds later. How many private billionaires have access to a single vehicle worth more than 4 brand new Bentley Mulsannes, protected by infrastructure exceeding $100 million, that can survive direct military assault? Comment below. $1 trillion delegation. Corporate giants leverage. Donald Trump had brought Elon Musk of Tesla, Tim Cook of Apple, Jensen Huang of Nvidia, Larry Fink of BlackRock, David Solomon of Goldman Sachs, Kelly Ortberg of Boeing, Citigroup, MasterCard, Cargill, Blackstone, Qualcomm, Micron, GE Aerospace. Together, these corporations controlled more than $10 trillion in market capitalization. The largest commercial delegation a sitting American president had brought to China in the modern era. This was not assembled for ceremonial photography. This was assembled because the president needed leverage. Elon Musk boarded with personal wealth approximating $250 billion, almost entirely denominated in Tesla stock. Tesla manufactures 95% of the Model Y and Model 3 vehicles destined for global markets in a single facility, the Shanghai Gigafactory. That facility produces approximately 950,000 vehicles annually. It represents $50 billion in asset value. Without Shanghai, Tesla's market valuation erodes by 30 to 40%, a potential loss of $300 to $400 billion in corporate market value. Musk's personal fortune would decline by $100 billion immediately. Musk boarded Air Force One carrying his wealth as visible proof of vulnerability. Tim Cook carried Apple's entire manufacturing ecosystem. Cook's personal wealth approximated $700 million to $1 billion, modest by billionaire standards. But Apple commands a market capitalization of approximately $3 trillion. Apple manufactures 95% of iPhones globally in Chinese facilities. The supply chains feeding iPhone assembly, rare earth processing, component manufacturing, packaging, logistics are so integrated into Chinese provincial economies that fragmenting them would require 5 to 10 years minimum and cost Apple hundreds of billions in lost productivity. China represents roughly 20% of Apple's annual revenue, approximately $80 to $90 billion annually. Jensen Huang arrived, carrying Nvidia's artificial intelligence monopoly. Nvidia manufactures the GPU processors powering the global artificial intelligence revolution. China desperately wants access to Nvidia technology. Huang boarded during a refueling stop in Alaska, a last-minute recruit signaling willingness to discuss technology access in exchange for market opening. Larry Fink brought $11 trillion in assets under management at BlackRock. BlackRock manages approximately $150 to $200 billion directly invested in Chinese markets. That investment creates dependencies. Chinese provincial governments rely on BlackRock capital for infrastructure development. Chinese corporations rely on BlackRock's index inclusion for valuation support. Kelly Ortberg of Boeing brought desperation. Beijing had raised tariffs on American goods to 125% in April of the previous year. Boeing needed aircraft orders. When a president travels with this much corporate firepower, he is not negotiating from strength, he is selling access. Levin's reception. State pageantry measured. The welcoming ceremony at Beijing's airport was choreographed to project Chinese power. Military honor guard with goose-stepping precision. Children waving flags. Red banners. The kind of state reception typically reserved for heads of state. The Great Hall of the People was prepared for bilateral meetings. The Temple of Heaven scheduled for a visit. A formal state banquet planned for the evening. A state banquet in Beijing, particularly for an American president, carries significant operational expenses. Similar international state dinners in major capitals typically cost between $300,000 and $500,000. A banquet at the Great Hall of the People, with hundreds of guests, multiple courses representing Chinese regional cuisines, wine service, and security requirements, likely exceeded those figures substantially. Conservative estimates suggest the Chinese government spent between $500,000 and $1 million on the reception and banquet alone. The meal itself featured premium ingredients: Peking duck from heritage birds, rare seafood flown in fresh from coastal provinces, handcrafted desserts. The table settings, porcelain, silverware, baccarat crystal, were items typically reserved for state occasions. The baccarat crystal service alone, imported from France, represented tens of thousands of dollars. The venue itself required extensive preparation, security sweeps, staff coordination. The logistics of hosting a president and a delegation of corporate executives required mobilizing thousands of personnel across Beijing municipal government structures. The Great Hall of the People itself, the seat of Chinese state power, had hosted fewer than 50 foreign leaders at this level in its entire operational history since 1959. Trump's delegation stayed at the Peninsula Beijing or similar five-star properties. Room rates at these establishments run $2,000 to $5,000 per night for presidential suites. With a delegation of 20 to 30 people staying 2 to 3 nights, accommodation alone exceeded $200,000. Add security, ground transportation, meals outside of state functions, and the total cost of housing this delegation exceeded $500,000. The Peninsula Beijing itself, located in the heart of Beijing's most exclusive district, features suites with panoramic views, marble bathrooms with heated floors, and personalized concierge service. Carney's advantage: Canada secured deal first. But this summit existed within a context Trump could not escape. 4 months before Trump touched down in Beijing, another aircraft had already landed there. It carried Mark Carney, Prime Minister of Canada, the first visit by a Canadian Prime Minister to China since 2017, the same 9-year gap Trump was now closing, except Carney got there first. Carney walked into the Great Hall of the People, met with President Xi Jinping, met with Premier Li Keqiang, met with Zhao Leji, chairman of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress. He met them not as a supplicant, but as the leader of a G7 nation deliberately rebalancing its foreign policy. And he came home with something concrete: a Canada-China strategic partnership, energy cooperation with both countries described as energy superpowers committing to expand two-way investment in batteries, solar, wind, and energy storage, clean technology and climate competitiveness, agri-food and wood products. A formal ambition to grow Canadian exports to China by 50% by 2030, visa-free travel access for Canadian citizens, Beijing's support for Canada's bid to host the 2029 APEC summit. Then the financial specifics. China agreed in principle to slash tariffs on Canadian canola seed from approximately 85% down to roughly 15%. That was a $4 billion market for Canadian farmers suddenly becoming viable again. Canola meal, lobsters, crabs, Canadian peas. Removed from the tariff list, the combined effect unlocked nearly $3 billion in export orders for Canadian workers and businesses. $3 billion. Without firing a single trade war shot. Without threats, without coercion. That is structural realignment in real commerce. Trump responded within days. He went on Truth Social. If Governor Carney thinks he is going to make Canada a drop-off port for China, he is sorely mistaken. He threatened 100% tariffs on Canadian exports if Ottawa made a deal with Beijing. He demoted Carney from Prime Minister to Governor in his own social media post, a deliberate insult. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, Trump went further. Carney had given an address warning against economic coercion by superpowers. Trump's response was direct: Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements. He withdrew Canada's invitation to his so-called Board of Peace. And then, 4 months later, Trump boarded Air Force One with Musk, with Cook, with Huang, with Fink, with the chief executives of Boeing and Goldman Sachs and BlackRock, to ask Xi Jinping for trade access, to ask for help in Iran, to ask for a market opening, to ask for the same kind of engagement that he had called a betrayal when Canada did it. Either engaging China is acceptable, or it is not. It cannot be both, and yet, that is exactly the position Washington was now defending. Beijing's hub, new diplomatic geometry emerges. Beijing's response was patient and precise. Chinese state media spent the week reminding the world that Trump was the one who postponed this summit because of the Iran war. Reminding the world that Iran's foreign minister visited Beijing just the previous week, arriving for bilateral meetings that suggested diplomatic alternatives to American mediation. Reminding the world that Vladimir Putin was expected to arrive in the Chinese capital within days after Trump left. Reminding the world, in short, that Beijing is the hub of a new diplomatic geometry and that the American president is just one of several visitors passing through. The message was implicit but unmistakable. Beijing has options. Beijing has Russia. Beijing has Iran. Beijing has the global south. Beijing doesn't need to negotiate with Washington because Washington is negotiating with Beijing. American allies were recalibrating their assumptions about American commitment in real time. Japan and South Korea, who watched the Trump administration divert military resources from the Pacific toward the Middle East. That redeployment signaled a shift in strategic priorities away from the Indo-Pacific security architecture. Germany and France, who watched the Iran war drag on past every Trump prediction. The American president said 4 to 6 weeks. By May, 3 months had passed. That pattern destroys credibility with European allies. India, which continued to buy Russian oil throughout the conflict despite American sanctions threats. And Canada, which is now 4 months ahead of the United States in opening a new commercial relationship with the world's second-largest economy. You remember when the conventional wisdom was that no major American ally would dare make a separate strategic deal with Beijing. That conventional wisdom is gone. Carney did it in January. The Europeans are watching the canola deal closely. Australia is rebuilding its own wine and barley trade with China. The wall that Washington spent the better part of a decade building around Beijing is now full of doors. Inside the United States, Trump's approval rating sat at record low territory. Gas prices were up sharply because of the Strait of Hormuz blockade. The Iran war was into its 3rd month with no end in sight. The midterm elections were in November. He needed deliverables. Photographs of CEOs shaking hands, Boeing aircraft orders, soybean purchases, a lifeline to Iran. Meanwhile, in Ottawa, Mark Carney had spent the 4 months since his Beijing trip building exactly the kind of position Canada had not held for a generation. A G7 leader with a working channel to Xi Jinping. A G7 leader with a multi-billion-dollar farm export deal already in motion. A G7 leader who had publicly warned superpowers against economic coercion and survived their threats when Trump attempted to punish Canada. Taiwan minefield. Trump's extemporaneous risk. Trump has signaled that he intends to raise Taiwan with Xi. He has even suggested he may discuss American arms sales to Taipei. Language that, if mishandled, could give Beijing exactly the diplomatic opening it has wanted for decades. Analysts in Washington and Taipei are warning openly that the president's tendency to speak extemporaneously could cost the United States its long-standing strategic ambiguity. A single off-script sentence in the wrong room could redraw the Taiwan question for a generation. Canada, notably, has stayed entirely out of that conversation. Carney's January trip did not touch Taiwan. He left that fault line alone because he understood that Canada's interests lay in trade, not in entanglement. That is the difference in approach. One leader went to Beijing in January with a focused brief, came home with a structural deal, and refused to be drawn into theatrics. The other leader went to Beijing in May with the largest corporate delegation in memory, an unsolved war behind him, falling poll numbers around him, and a Taiwan minefield in front of him. Watch the Putin visit. Russia's president is expected to arrive in the Chinese capital within days after Trump leaves. That is not an accident of scheduling. That is Beijing reminding Washington that it has options, that it has Russia, that it has Iran, and that the American president, for all the corporate jets parked at the Beijing airport this week, is one negotiation partner among several. The world has stopped revolving around Washington. Trump arrived in Beijing with the largest corporate delegation in modern history because American power no longer radiates from Washington. It is held hostage by corporations whose survival depends on Chinese tolerance and market access. Mark Carney walked into Beijing 4 months earlier with a focused agenda, secured $3 billion in export orders, and walked back out with a structural deal, while Trump was threatening tariffs against Canadian engagement. There are 3 lessons. Lesson 1. Institutional leverage has shifted. American corporations depend on China more than China depends on American corporations. Tesla needs Shanghai. Apple needs Chinese manufacturing. Nvidia needs Chinese markets. That dependency becomes a strategic liability when converted into diplomatic leverage. Presence proves vulnerability. Lesson 2. Timing and focus matter more than raw firepower. Mark Carney spent weeks preparing a specific agenda and got what he asked for. Trump packed every contentious issue into 48 hours and signaled desperation to everyone watching. Lesson 3. Allies are making independent decisions. Australia is rebuilding its own China trade. Europe is hedging its American commitment. Canada got a deal first and proved it could be done without Washington permission. If this shifted how you see American power in 2026, like and subscribe to Wealth Dominion. Your support is what motivates us to release Part 2, which will reveal secret details and plot points from the meeting that the press hasn't yet reported. Thank you.